Wipe it properly. At least that's something you can manage, isn't it? Claire Whitlock opened her hand. The coffee cup dropped onto the exact stretch of marble Grant Mercer had just finished cleaning, spreading into a wide brown streak. She dragged her heel through it, unhurried, making it longer. A few people behind her laughed. Grant said nothing. He knelt, wiped the floor clean, then looked up at the name badge on her chest. Why would a janitor the whole building looked past need to remember exactly who had just humiliated him? Every weekday morning at Hawthorne Technologies began the same way. The glass doors along the east face opened and closed in a steady rhythm, releasing a current of people in dark coats who crossed the lobby without ever looking at it. Badge readers chirped. Elevators filled and emptied. Above the reception desk, a screen cycled through quarterly figures, and almost nobody looked up at it. Nearly 4,000 people worked in that building, and the building had taught them one lesson about each other. What a person wore told you how much attention they were owed. Grant Mercer came in through the north service entrance at 6:40, more than an hour ahead of the first wave. His uniform was gray, laundered so many times the seams had gone pale, and the patch over the pocket read only G. Mercer. The building services supervisor had handed him a temporary badge, walked him through the second-floor supply closet, and told him what he told everyone. Keep the cart out of the main walkways. Stay off the main elevators at peak hours. Don't talk to the office staff unless they talk to you first. Grant had thanked him and meant it. He was in his early 50s, average height, with a face that gave nothing away and a pair of hands that clearly knew work. The building services crews ran on a rotation, a week of mornings and then a week that started at 1 in the afternoon and ended at 10 at night, and he took both without complaint. He signed his timesheet in the same careful handwriting every shift. He learned where the floor drains were and which automatic doors stuck in the cold. He lived alone. He had done the raising of a family by himself, and that had left him with a habit he never lost. He measured what things cost in hours rather than dollars. When he pushed the cart across the lobby, he did not see marble and glass. He saw how long it took one person to keep it looking like that, and how many people walked over it without registering that anyone had. The first thing he noticed about Hawthorne was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. People sorted each other instantly in elevators and corridors and at the reception desk without deciding to. A woman in a suit got a nod. A man with a cart got a step to the side. He watched a delivery driver stand at the desk for 9 minutes while 2 employees finished a conversation about a restaurant, and he watched the driver accept it as normal because it was. By the end of the second day, he had stopped being surprised by it and started keeping track. He learned that the 4th-floor break room ran out of cups by 10 and that nobody had wiped the 9th-floor microwave in months. He learned which managers said good morning to the cleaning crew and which ones had a way of looking through a person that was not rudeness exactly, more like an eye adjusting past something at the wrong depth of field. He learned that the loading dock crews ate lunch on the dock in all weather because the cafeteria had been quietly reserved for badge holders above a certain grade, and that no memo anywhere said so. Nothing on that list was a violation. Every item on it was legal, ordinary, and repeated every day by people who would have described themselves as decent, which was exactly what made it worth writing down. Claire Whitlock ran operations for the Western Division out of the 11th floor, and she was good at it. She arrived early, dressed like the job she wanted rather than the one she had, and kept her numbers clean. When she walked through the building, she walked as though the corridor had been built for her, which in every way that counted it had. She knew every senior name at Hawthorne, and she knew which of them mattered. She also knew, without ever having to think about it, which people in that building required none of her attention at all. Grant had been mopping the lobby for 4 days before she registered that he existed, and she registered it only because he was in her way. He was working the marble near the north elevator bank that Thursday, laying the mop down in long, overlapping passes with the caution sign set at the edge of the wet section when she came through with 2 of her supervisors. He pulled the cart back to give her room. She looked at the wet floor, then at him, and something about a man on his knees in her path seemed to strike her as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. She opened her hand. The cup cracked on the stone and coffee spread across the section he had finished 30 seconds earlier. Wipe it properly, Claire said. At least that's something you can manage, isn't it? One of the supervisors laughed, then the other, then a woman waiting for the elevator smiled without knowing what she was smiling at. Claire put her heel into the edge of the spill and dragged it out another 2 feet across the clean floor. Then she stepped over it and kept walking. Grant did not answer her. He collected the broken pieces onto the lower shelf of the cart, mopped the coffee, changed the water, and went over the whole section again so it would dry without a ring. It took him 11 minutes. When he finished, he stood, rolled his shoulder once, and read the name on the badge hanging from her lanyard, and he put it in his memory the way a man puts a receipt in his pocket. He did not feel what those supervisors thought he felt. He was not embarrassed and he was not angry, and both of those absences surprised him. What he felt was closer to attention, the sharpening that comes when something you had only suspected turns out to be true in front of you. 8 minutes later, he was still on that same stretch of floor when Preston Vance came out of the executive elevator. Vance was the regional operations director, 60 years old, silver-haired, in a suit that did not need to announce itself. He moved slowly and never raised his voice, and the building parted around him anyway. Grant watched Claire spot him from 30 feet away and watched what happened to her face. Everything in it changed. Her shoulders came down. Her expression opened into something warm and easy. She crossed the lobby with her phone already put away, and when Vance said something about a report, she laughed, and it sounded genuine, and it very probably was. She noticed he was carrying a folder and a laptop bag in the same hand and took the folder before he had to ask. She held the elevator and let him enter first. Grant leaned on the mop handle and watched the doors close on the two of them. He had come into that building expecting to find people who did not know how to treat others decently. What he had just watched was the opposite. Claire Whitlock knew exactly how to be gracious. She was fluent in it. She could produce warmth on demand, calibrate it, deliver it perfectly. She simply ran the calculation first, and she decided who was worth spending it on based on what that person could do for her. It was not ignorance. It was a policy, executed flawlessly in both directions. That was worse, and it was also more useful because a policy comes from somewhere. He finished the lobby and moved the cart toward the freight corridor a little before 11. Walter Boyd had worked the central warehouse for 19 years. He was 63, thick through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent their lives lifting things, and he had 2 years left before his pension came due. That morning, he had been asked to carry a set of inventory reconciliations up to the 11th floor because the file transfer had failed twice, and somebody wanted them on paper before noon. He took the main elevator because the service car on the west side had been out since Tuesday, with a laminated sign taped over the call button. Claire came out of the 11th floor conference room as the doors opened and stopped in front of him. "This car is for staff and clients," she said. "You have a service elevator for a reason." Walter shifted the folders against his chest and explained that the service elevator was down, that maintenance had said another 2 days, and that he had been told to have the reconciliations upstairs before 12. "Then go back down and find another way," Claire said. "I have people coming through this floor at 11:15. You don't stand in my hallway in a warehouse coat." Walter turned back toward the elevator. He was tired. The folders were the wrong shape to carry with one arm, and the top 3 slid off the stack and hit the floor. Paper fanned across the corridor, and some of it went under the bench outside the conference room. There were 7 people in that hallway. 2 by the water station looked at the mess and then looked away. 1 stepped over the pages without breaking stride. Claire was already gone. Grant set his cart against the wall and knelt down. He gathered the sheets by page number, squaring them as he went, and slid the ones under the bench out with the handle of a brush. Walter got down on one knee beside him, slowly, the way a man does when his knees have opinions about it. "You don't have to do that," Walter said. "It's faster with 2, Grant said. They worked in silence until the last of it was collected. Grant handed over the stack, and Walter squared it against his thigh and looked at it rather than at Grant. 19 years I've been in that warehouse," he said. 2 more and I'm out. And in 19 years, I don't think 3 people upstairs have ever learned my name." He got up with a hand on the wall. It isn't the yelling. You get used to the yelling. It's that they look right through you. Down on the loading floor, we all know it. You stop expecting to exist above the fourth floor, and after a while you stop noticing that you stopped. Tsit. He said it without heat, and that was the part that stayed with Grant. There was no complaint in it. It was a description of the weather. "Does anybody say anything?" Grant asked. Walter looked at him then, almost kindly, the way you look at someone who hasn't been somewhere long enough to know better. "Say it to who? You go to your manager, and your manager is the one who did it. That's the whole system, friend. You're new, you'll see it." He tucked the folders under his arm and took the stairwell instead of the elevator, and Grant watched the door swing shut behind him. He stood alone in that corridor for a while afterward. He had prepared himself for something buried, something that would take weeks of watching to surface. That was not what he had found. In 4 days, he had been humiliated in the lobby by a woman who had never once considered that he might have a name. He had watched that same woman be genuinely lovely to a man in a good suit, and he had watched 7 employees step around an old man's paperwork because helping him carried no return. None of it was hidden. All of it happened in the open, in the middle of the day, in front of everyone. That was what made his jaw tighten. It happened in the open because nobody involved believed it was worth hiding. The easy move was sitting right there in his pocket, one phone call. He could walk onto the 11th floor tomorrow in a different set of clothes and watch Claire Whitlock's face come apart, and it would be finished by lunch, and it would feel very good for about a day. And then what? Then Hawthorne would have a new operations manager for the Western Division, the same numbers on the same spreadsheet, the same service elevator out of order, and the next person in a gray uniform would push a cart across that lobby and be treated exactly the same way because nothing that produced Claire Whitlock would have changed by a single degree. He thought about how she had gone soft the instant Vance appeared. That was not a woman who lacked judgment. That was a woman being judged by somebody and adjusting. Whatever was running in that building did not start on the lobby floor. It ran downhill to the lobby floor from somewhere higher up, and it arrived there in the form of a coffee cup. So he did not make the call. He rinsed the mop head, hung it on the rack, restocked the cart with liners and glass cleaner, and came back the next morning at 6:40 and put the gray uniform back on. He kept the guests out of the main walkways. He stayed off the main elevators at peak hours. He did not talk to the office staff unless they talked to him first, and almost none of them ever did, which was precisely the point. A janitor could be anywhere in that building at any hour and nobody would ask what he was doing there. He could wipe down a conference table while 2 managers finished a conversation they had not bothered to pause. He could empty a bin in a records room. He could stand 10 feet from a desk for 4 full minutes and be less noticed than the furniture. For the first time since he had walked through those doors, Grant Mercer understood that the uniform was not the disguise. It was the instrument. The cart gave him the run of the building, and the building gave him everything else. Over the next 2 weeks, he worked 9 floors on rotation, and the gray uniform functioned like a key. Conversations did not stop when he entered a room. Screens were not turned away. He wiped down a table on the 11th floor while 2 managers argued about head count 18 inches from his elbow, and neither lowered his voice because lowering your voice requires first believing that someone is listening. What he heard did not match a single page of what Hawthorne published about itself. Contract workers stayed late 4 and 5 nights a week, and a portion of those hours never reached the timesheets. Warehouse staff were told, not in writing but clearly enough, that incidents driving up operating costs should be handled internally before they became reports. Service crews were handed work well outside their contracts, and they did it because the contracts renewed every 90 days and everyone understood what that meant. Grant had spent his life reading operational reports. He had never once seen this in one. On a Tuesday afternoon, he was refilling the paper dispenser outside the 11th floor break room when a young man in a contractor badge came up the corridor with a printout in his hand and stopped at Claire Whitlock's door. Danny Ross was 26 and had been on a contract line for 7 months. He held the printout out in front of him like a man presenting evidence, and he had clearly rehearsed the opening on the way up. "Ms. Whitlock, my timesheet's short again, almost 6 hours from last month. I've got my badge scans right here. I came in at 6 on the 11th and the 12th, and the sheet has me down for 8 hours both days. Claire did not take the printout and did not get up from her desk. Those hours were reviewed and approved, she said. Approved means finished, Danny. It doesn't mean approved until you come up here and disagree with it. He started on the scans again, quieter, and she cut across him without raising her voice at all, which was somehow worse than if she had. Let me be clear so we're not doing this again in 3 weeks. You're on a 90-day contract line. There is a stack of applications downstairs for that line, and every one of them would take it tomorrow and not come to my office about 6 hours. If the arrangement doesn't work for you, that's information I'd rather have now. Danny stood in the doorway a moment. Then he folded the printout in half and in half again and walked back down the corridor past Grant without seeing him. Grant caught up with him at the stairwell landing and asked how long it had been happening. Danny let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Since I started, it's not just me. They round you down, they call it a system error, and the system only ever errs in one direction. Nobody pushes back. You don't understand how 90 days works. Danny leaned against the rail. Day 1, you tell yourself you'll say something when you've proved yourself. Day 30, you've got a renewal coming and you think, not now, wait until it's signed. Day 60, they renew you and you're grateful so you don't. Day 90, it starts again. Nobody has to threaten you. The calendar does it for them. He shrugged. By month 4, you're not staying quiet because you're scared. You're staying quiet because you've stopped thinking of it as something that can be changed. Grant went back and finished the dispenser and said nothing else. He had come into that building thinking of the coffee cup as the problem. Standing in that stairwell, he understood it never had been. The coffee cup was what the problem looked like when it surfaced. Underneath it was something with a shape and a mechanism, running on 6 hours here and a fault report there, and it had been running long enough that the people inside it had stopped calling it anything but Tuesday. He found the rest of it 2 days later, and he found it because someone else was already trying to fix it. It was past 7 in the evening on the 8th floor, most of the lights on the dimmers, his rotation running late that week. He was emptying bins along the human resources corridor when he heard 2 voices in a small conference room and saw Danny Ross at the table with his badge scans spread out in front of him. The woman across from him had her sleeves pushed up and was working through the printouts with a pen, building something on a legal pad line by line. Megan Foster had been in human resources at Hawthorne for 6 years. When she looked up and saw the uniform in the doorway, she did not do what everyone else in the building did. She said good evening, and she used his name because she had read it off his pocket at some point and kept it. You're the one from the lobby, Mercer. Grant. Megan. She tapped the pad with her pen. We'll be out of your way in 20 minutes. He told her to take her time, and then, because the room was quiet and she had not treated him like furniture, he asked how often she did this. She set the pen down. How often do I sit here after hours rebuilding somebody's month-off badge scans? More than I should have to. Her eyes went to Danny and back. This isn't the 5th one. Complaints about hours have been coming off the contract lines for 2 years. I've written some of them up myself, and I can tell you exactly what happens. They go into the system, they sit, and somewhere between my desk and the executive floor, they stop existing. Where does it stop? That's the question I'd want in your position. She turned the pad around, not to show him anything, just to give her hand something to do. It starts with a number. Operations carries a labor cost target every quarter, and for several quarters that target has been under budget by a margin you cannot reach by working smarter. You can only reach it by working somebody for free, and the signature on that target is Preston Vance. Grant kept his voice level. Does Vance tell people to shave timesheets? He has never told anyone to do anything. That's what makes him good at it. He sets a number that can't be hit clean, tells his managers he has confidence in them, and goes home. Whatever they do to hit it is their handwriting, not his. If it comes apart, the person holding the pen is the person holding the bag. You know what this costs you if it goes wrong. I have a mortgage and no other offer on the table. She picked the pen back up. But if everyone who knows what's happening here stays quiet to protect their own job, then the people at the bottom of this building have nobody left standing on their side. Not one. I'd rather be the one who's inconvenient. Grant went back out into the corridor with the liner in his hand and stood in the dim for a long moment, and the way he was thinking about all of it shifted. He had spent 3 weeks looking at how this building treated a man in a gray uniform. That question was answered. It had been answered in the lobby with a coffee cup and in the 11th floor corridor with an old man on his knees, and there was nothing left in it worth learning. The real question was the one Megan had just handed him, not who was rude, who was covering. Because a system that quietly deletes complaints on their way upstairs is not a culture problem. It is a control failure, and control failures never stay confined to timesheets. He saw the pressure land on Claire 2 days after that. He was wiping down the glass on the 11th floor when Vance came through and asked her to step inside with him, and the door did not shut all the way. Grant kept the cloth moving. Vance did not raise his voice. He never did. Your division is running 4% over on labor for the quarter. That's not a catastrophe. It's a number people upstairs will read out loud in a room where I'd rather they read a different one. Claire started to explain something about warehouse overtime, and he let her get a sentence and a half into it. Claire, I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm telling you where you stand. His tone stayed pleasant throughout. The operations director seat opens in the spring. Right now, you are the obvious name in that conversation. Obvious names stop being obvious the moment they turn up attached to a division that missed its target 2 quarters running. I have confidence you'll bring it in. I always have. He came out first, unhurried, and went toward the elevators. Claire came out about 40 seconds later, and Grant, working the glass with his back half turned, saw her face before she rebuilt it. The color had gone out of it. She stood with one hand flat against the wall for a second, then straightened her jacket, and by the time she reached her office door, she was the same woman who had dropped a cup on his clean floor. Grant folded the cloth and set it on the cart. He was not going to feel sorry for her. He had watched her humiliate a 63-year-old man over an elevator and tell a young contractor he was replaceable, and nothing behind that door excused a minute of it. But he understood now that if he removed Claire Whitlock from this building tomorrow, the number would still be there in the spring, still unreachable, still signed by a man who never told anyone to do anything. The line was crossed 4 days later in the evening, outside a conference room on the 11th floor. Grant was running the buffer along that corridor when he heard the safety inspection come up. He shut the machine off and moved to the baseboards with a cloth, close enough to hear. Hawthorne's internal safety inspection team had flagged the number 4 lift at the central warehouse. Brake system fault, written up as a serious defect with a recommendation that the unit come out of service immediately and stay out until repaired. Claire's voice carried clearly. Taking number 4 down meant renting a replacement and paying the crew overtime to redistribute the load, and that put the division near 7% over on the quarter instead of 4. Vance answered in the same reasonable tone he used for everything. I've read the report. It's very absolute. Inspection language usually is. A chair moved. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to write an operational summary. That's your area, not mine. I'll only say that the way risk is characterized in a document has a great deal to do with how it gets read, and I have confidence you can characterize it proportionately. Then he said he had a car waiting, and he left. He left first. He always left first. Claire stayed in that room another 19 minutes. Grant was still on the baseboards when she came out with the folder under her arm, and the printer on 11 ran twice after that. Whatever came out of it carried her signature and not Vance's. Vance had said nothing that could be quoted against him. He had used the words confidence and proportionate, and he had gone home. And the only other person alive who had heard him say them was a janitor with a cloth in his hand. The original report went into the routine monthly shredding cycle 2 days later in a stack of superseded paperwork from the 11th floor. Grant was the one who wheeled the bins down to the loading area. He took the 12 pages out, folded them once, and put them in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, and locked them in his locker in the basement changing room that night. 6 days after that, Walter Boyd filed a fault report on the number 4 lift because it had slipped a load during a shift transfer and the operators had stopped using it. Claire did not take it out of service. She called him up to the 11th floor and told him that reporting equipment issues outside the proper channel created alarm on the floor, and that alarm was a productivity cost like any other. Then she entered a note in his personnel file about escalating operational matters improperly. Grant learned about the note from Megan, and the note changed the temperature of the whole thing, because up to that point the arithmetic had been ugly but survivable. 6 hours off a timesheet was a phone bill. A humiliation in a lobby was a bad morning. This was a document stating that a machine would injure someone, a decision to keep the machine running, and a formal warning placed in the file of the man who had said so out loud. The man had a name. He was 63 years old. He had 19 years in that warehouse and 2 left before his pension, and he stood underneath that lift every working day. Grant began working with Megan in the evenings after that, meeting in the 8th floor conference room when the floor was thin, mapping which complaints and reports had been altered or removed and when. Megan found what he needed in the audit logs, and then she found the problem inside it. "The system keeps an edit trail," she said, turning the screen. "Every change is time-stamped. I can show you the hour a complaint was closed without resolution, when time entries were adjusted downward, when the safety summary was revised." "Then that's it." "No, look at the account column. Every single edit had gone through one login. Operations kept a shared administrative account, the credentials unchanged for at least 3 years, held by half the managers in the division." "The logs prove somebody altered this data," Megan said. "They do not prove who. Not one of these entries carries a person's name, it carries a department." Grant looked at the screen a long time. The data said a crime had been committed and could not say by whom, which meant everything now rested on the 2 things that lived outside the system: 12 pages folded in a basement locker, and a conversation about the word proportionate that one man in a gray uniform had heard through a door that hadn't quite closed. Claire found the trail 9 days before the quarterly review, and she found it the way people usually find things, by accident. A system administrator flagged an unusual pattern out of routine caution. Someone in human resources had been opening closed complaint files going back 2 years, dozens of them, outside business hours. The account was not shared. It belonged to Megan Foster. Claire called her into the 11th floor office at 4 in the afternoon and did not offer her a chair. "You've been reopening resolved personnel matters without authorization from the managers who closed them. You've been altering time records for contract staff at night off cycle, and you did not raise one of these through your own reporting line." Megan said she had raised them repeatedly and that everyone had died somewhere above her desk. "That's a story," Claire said. "What I have is an access log with your name on it. You're suspended pending investigation, effective now." Megan's system access was revoked before she reached the elevator. It took a little under 90 seconds. Claire spent the rest of that evening assembling the file, and it was not difficult because the architecture of it had been waiting 3 years. Every altered time entry, every closed complaint, every revision had gone through the shared operations account, and that account carried a department, not a person. It named no one, which meant it could be made to name anyone. Against that stood one employee demonstrably in those records at night, on her own login, without approval. A woman in human resources acting alone. It would hold in front of anyone who did not already know better. The next thing Claire did was order a special clearance of the 3rd floor archive ahead of the review. Old time records, closed complaint folders, superseded inspection paperwork, 4 rolling bins scheduled for destruction pickup requested under a retention line item nobody would read twice. Grant went down to the archive room that evening to pull whatever was left. He was crouched at an open banker's box with a folder half out of it when the door opened behind him and the overhead lights came up to full. Claire stood in the doorway. It took her a second to understand what she was looking at, and then her face did something he had not seen on it before, which was pure, uncomplicated certainty. "Get up. Slowly." He stood. He offered no explanation, and she wanted none. From where she stood, the situation required no interpretation at all. A temporary janitor alone in a restricted records room after hours with confidential files in his hands, days before a quarterly review, on the same day a human resources employee had been caught pulling old complaints. She called security from the wall phone without taking her eyes off him. Badge. Grant unclipped it and set it on the table between them. Your contract is terminated as of this moment, not at the end of the week, now. Her voice had gone flat and efficient, the tone of someone doing paperwork. Everything in your locker is company property until it's cleared. It gets seized and sealed under the misconduct procedure, and it does not leave this building. That was the moment, and Grant felt it land, and nothing visible in his expression changed. The 12 pages were folded inside the jacket, hanging in his basement locker. Under that procedure, the locker would be emptied into a sealed bag, tagged, and held by the same operations department that was currently destroying 4 bins of records. 2 guards came down and took him up through the lobby, one on each side, not touching him, walking at his pace. He was walked across the same marble where a cup had cracked in front of his mop, past the north elevator bank, past the desk with the quarterly figures cycling above it. Some of the same people who had laughed that Thursday morning watched him go. Without a flicker of recognition that these were connected events, and one of them said, loud enough to carry, that the janitor had finally been caught at something. The doors closed behind him. He stood on the sidewalk in a gray uniform with no badge, and behind him the building went on running exactly as it had. What he had lost was not power. He had never lost that, not for 1 minute of the 7 weeks he had spent inside those walls. He could end this with a telephone call tonight, and part of him wanted to badly enough that he had to stand still on the pavement until it passed. What he had lost was time, and the difference mattered more than anything else in the world right now. If he walked back in tomorrow and announced who he was with the file half built, this stopped being a governance failure and became something much smaller and much easier for everyone above it to survive. It became the story of a chairman insulted by a middle manager who had come back to destroy her, and every finding after that would be read through that lens. Preston Vance would express deep concern, cooperate fully, and walk out without a mark, because he had never told anyone to do anything. Claire Whitlock would be written up as one individual with a judgment problem. The number would still be signed in the spring. He made the call from the car. The lead of the independent audit team picked up on the second ring, and Grant told her to move everything forward. The third-floor archive was being destroyed tonight, and a human resources employee had been suspended and was being positioned to carry all of it. Then he told her the part that mattered most. A locker in the basement had been seized and sealed under the misconduct procedure within the last hour, and the seal was going to be broken by the same department under investigation. He wanted custody of that bag transferred to the audit team before anyone in operations touched it, tonight in writing, with the building services supervisor as witness. She told him it would be in her possession within the hour, unopened. The second call came at 10:40 that night from the same auditor. The number 4 lift had dropped a load during the night shift at the central warehouse. A pallet came off the forks at height and went into the concrete about 6 feet from where Walter Boyd was standing. He was not hurt. The shift stopped. The floor supervisor cleared the area and phoned it up the line, and by midnight he had been told how the entry would read: not equipment fault, operator error. The operator on the number 4 lift that night had been Walter Boyd. Grant sat with the phone in his hand a long moment after the call ended. He was not thinking about Claire or the lobby or the guards. He was thinking about a man with 19 years in that warehouse and 2 left before his pension, standing on a concrete floor at 10 at night, being told that the machine everyone had been warned about had failed because of him. There was no version of this where Grant got to wait for the file to be perfect. The next time that lift let go, there would not be 6 feet. He told the auditor to send 2 of her people to take statements from Walter Boyd and Danny Ross before either came back on shift. Both were signed before 6 in the morning. Claire came in early the next day in a charcoal suit, in a genuinely good mood. She stopped at the coffee station on 11 and told a colleague she'd had a night of it, that she'd caught a temporary cleaner going through confidential files in the archive and had walked him out herself, and that between that and the human resources situation, she was fairly sure she had reached the bottom of the whole mess before the review. At 8:40, every senior manager in the building received the same calendar invitation, issued from the chairman's office, marked mandatory, with no subject line and no agenda. Claire walked into the executive conference room at 9 and stopped just inside the door. 4 directors, the chief legal counsel with 2 of her people, 6 members of an audit team she had never seen before, laptops open, boxes stacked along the wall, and at the far end of the table, Preston Vance sitting very straight in a chair that was not at the head of it, looking for the first time in Claire's memory like a man who did not know what came next. She took a seat halfway down and told herself it was an unannounced corporate review. At 2 minutes past 9, the door opened again. Grant Mercer came in. No cart, no gray uniform. He was in a dark suit, and he came through the door alongside the chief legal counsel and the woman leading the audit team, and he walked to the head of the table like a man returning to a chair he had left an hour ago. Claire's first reaction was not fear. It was confusion, then a spike of indignation because her mind produced the only explanation available to it. The janitor she had removed from the building last night had somehow gotten past security and into an executive meeting. Then one of the directors stood up, a second one stood, then the chief counsel, then the auditors, then almost everyone in the room in a wave that took about 4 seconds and made no sound at all. Claire remained seated because her body had stopped taking instructions. The chief legal counsel spoke first for the managers who had joined in the last 2 years and had only ever seen a photograph. For anyone who hasn't met him in person, Grant Mercer, chairman of the board and controlling shareholder of Hawthorne Technologies. He had run the company at a distance for most of 3 years, through a family holding trust whose name appeared in the annual report and nowhere else in the building, and nobody on the 11th floor had ever had reason to connect a surname on a maintenance patch to a signature on a filing. For 7 weeks he had been signing a timesheet in the basement because a volume of complaints had reached him that could not be reconciled with a single internal report he was being sent, and he had decided the only way to test a culture was to stand inside it wearing something that made him invisible. Claire understood it all at once. The man she had dropped a cup of coffee in front of, the man she had told to wipe the floor properly, the man she had stripped of his badge and had walked out through her own lobby by 2 guards 14 hours ago. Grant did not begin with any of that. "Last night at 10:32, he said, the number 4 lift at the central warehouse dropped a pallet from height. It landed 6 feet from a man named Walter Boyd. He has worked in that warehouse for 19 years. He has 2 years left before he retires." He set a folder on the table. No incident report was filed. The shift supervisor was instructed to record the cause as operator error. The operator was Walter Boyd, so the record we would have found a week from now would say that the man who reported the fault caused the fault. The lead auditor took the room through the data next without commentary. Edit trails on time entries for contract staff, all adjusted downward, all outside the pay period. Complaint files closed with no resolution field completed. A safety summary substantively revised after the inspection was issued. The timestamp at which Megan Foster's system access had been revoked, 9 days before the quarterly review, then she stated the limit of it plainly. Every one of these actions was executed through a shared operations administrative account, held by multiple managers and not rotated in 3 years. This data establishes that records were altered and a safety finding suppressed. It does not establish who ordered it. On this evidence alone, the individual most exposed is Megan Foster, because hers is the only personal login in the file. That was when Grant put the rest of it on the table. 12 pages of the original inspection report, taken out of a shredding bin the day before it was collected, describing a brake system defect on the number 4 lift and recommending immediate removal from service. A signed account of a conversation held outside a conference room on the 11th floor, in which the regional operations director told the Western Division manager that the way risk is characterized in a document has a great deal to do with how it gets read, that he had confidence she could characterize it proportionately, and then went home. Statements taken overnight from Walter Boyd and Danny Ross. The chief counsel summarized it in 2 sentences. "The system data tells us what was done. Only a witness who was physically present tells us who decided it. Without the second half, this file terminates at a mid-level human resources employee and goes no further." Vance came out of his chair at that. He said with real force that he had never instructed anyone to alter a document, that he had never seen the original report, that he could not be held responsible for how a manager chose to interpret an ordinary conversation about reporting standards. "I agree with you," Grant said. "You never instructed anyone. You set a labor target that could not be reached without taking hours from people who had already worked them. You told the people underneath you that you had confidence in them, and you left the room first every single time." "That is not a defense, Preston. That is the mechanism." The room stayed quiet. Grant turned to Claire then, and there was nothing in his voice that sounded like triumph. "If I had walked into that lobby on my first morning in this suit instead of the uniform, would you have dropped your coffee on the floor in front of me and told me to wipe it properly?" Claire opened her mouth. Nothing came out of it. "You are not under investigation because you insulted me," Grant said. "I want that on the record because it is the first thing this building will assume. If this were about a cup of coffee, I would not have needed a room full of directors, outside counsel, and an audit team to deal with it. I would have needed a phone call. What she was under investigation for was pressuring vulnerable employees, adjusting time records, suppressing complaints, and delaying a known safety hazard to protect a quarterly figure. Claire was suspended pending independent investigation, and so was Preston Vance, and Grant made the reason for the second suspension explicit in front of everyone. If we remove the person who signed and leave the person who set the number, then in 6 months there will be another manager in that same chair doing the same arithmetic, and she will believe she has no other option because she will not." Megan Foster was reinstated with the allegations against her withdrawn in full. The disciplinary note in Walter Boyd's file was struck and the previous night's incident refiled to reflect what had actually happened. The number 4 lift went out of service that morning and stayed out until it was repaired. Every time record for the past 2 years was audited and unpaid wages returned, beginning with the contract lines. Labor cost targets across the operations division were rebuilt from the ground up, and any target with a safety implication now required independent review before it could be issued. An independent complaint channel was established so that no manager could ever again sit between an employee and the person that employee needed to reach. The shared administrative account was destroyed. Every action taken against personnel data at Hawthorne would carry a name. Grant made one more point before the room broke up, and he made it deliberately. There were people in this building who did the right thing while this was happening, at real cost to themselves. Megan Foster kept her conscience while it was actively dangerous to keep it. That is not a small thing, and I don't want to treat it as one. He closed the folder in front of him. The purpose of this investigation is not to damage this company. It is to force it to become something the people working in it deserve. 4 days later, Grant walked back through the lobby. The people who had laughed when a cup of coffee cracked on that floor went silent the moment they recognized him, and he understood exactly what that silence was. It was not remorse, it was recalculation. He did not ask anyone for an apology, and he did not want to be treated better now that everyone knew he could reward them or end them, because that was the identical instinct that had produced all of this, only pointed in a more convenient direction. Halfway across, he stopped, because Walter Boyd was coming through with a clipboard, back on shift now that the lift had been repaired. Grant put out his hand and stood there talking with him about the warehouse for 4 or 5 minutes, in the middle of the floor in front of everyone. The lobby watched. It was the first time most of them had ever actually seen the man. The question Grant carried out of that building was not about himself, and it never had been. It was about the next person who would push a cart across that marble, someone who did not own the company, who had no title worth reading, and who could not come back the following morning in a chairman's suit and make it right. Hawthorne rewrote its procedures on wages, on safety, on complaints, and on the protection of people who report. More than that, Grant required every manager in the company to understand one thing: corporate culture is not measured by how you behave in front of the board. It is measured by how you treat the people who can do absolutely nothing for you. A title tells you what a person does. It does not decide what they are worth. Respect only means anything when it is given to people who have no power to reward you for it and no power to punish you for withholding it. Do not wait until you find out who someone is to decide whether they deserve to be treated decently.